Previously, in this presentation, I discussed how John McCain's ideas on foreign policy deviated from those of the American founders, and agreed instead with the jingoistic expansionism of people like Teddy Roosevelt. Now, I continue this investigation into whose ideas are McCain's ideas the most like. One other person that comes to mind is Woodrow Wilson, who got the United States into World War I after being elected under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He agreed with McCain and Teddy Roosevelt on many foreign policy issues. For instance, in his war message on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson said, "Armed neutrality, it now appears, is impracticable." Never mind the 140-odd years of American history where armed neutrality was practiced and quite practicable, despite the fact that Europe erupted in periodic major conflicts, and America stayed out of them and everything was fine from Americans' standpoints. Never mind that. It's now all of a sudden impracticable. Furthermore, Wilson said, "We are at the beginning of an age in which it will be insisted that the same standards of conduct and responsibility for wrong done shall be observed among nations and their governments that are observed among the individual citizens of civilized states." So, what happened to non-interventionism, neutrality, keeping out of foreign alliances? Now the United States, according to Wilson, has a moral responsibility to enforce proper conduct among all the nations of the world. That is truly a radical departure from the kind of foreign policy that the founders recommended. And furthermore, Wilson said that a steadfast concert for peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. Now, this of course led to the failed League of Nations, which was a precursor to the United Nations, and both of them were huge entangling alliances, exactly of the kind that Washington and Jefferson warned against. John McCain, in his foreign policy proposals, is not suggesting that the United States get out of the United Nations and cease this ridiculous entangling alliance, which imposes great burdens on liberty worldwide. So, who else would have agreed with John McCain in principle on foreign policy? Franklin Roosevelt, who instituted the first peacetime military draft in 1940 and eagerly entered the United States into World War II, agreed with McCain, Theodore Roosevelt, and Wilson. He said, even prior to World War II, at the beginning of the New Deal, the American people must march forward as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline. At one point in time, I put this quote, along with two quotations from Hitler and Mussolini, on a forum, and asked people to identify the authors of each quotation, essentially an undertaking of matching the authors to the statements. And until I gave the answers, nobody could guess the correct answer, because the quotations from Hitler, Mussolini, and FDR were so similar. You can guess the answers yourself when you watch my video, Franklin Roosevelt and the Fascists. Furthermore, in a disturbing address called A Call to Sacrifice from 1942, Franklin Roosevelt said, "The price for civilization must be paid in hard work and sorrow and blood. The price is not too high." And both McCain and Teddy Roosevelt would agree that the price for civilization is to be paid in sorrow and blood. Now, I do think civilization requires hard work to create, but it does not require sorrow and blood. It does not require destroying things, because civilization is primarily about building things, about creating things, about engaging in peaceful, productive work, commerce, cultural exchange, running a business, raising a family. That is what civilized life is about, not going to war and destroying things. So FDR is wrong, dangerously, devastatingly wrong here. Now, a disturbing part of FDR's call to sacrifice is, I think, a foreshadowing of what would happen under a McCain presidency. FDR said, "This great effort must be carried through to its victorious conclusion by the indomitable will and determination of the people as one great whole," once again a reification of a collectivity. "It must not be impeded by the faint of heart," the men of timid peace whom Teddy Roosevelt condemned. "It must not be impeded by those who put their own selfish interests above the interests of the nation," hence McCain's call to put country first above all else, and have people sacrifice their own self-interests to the interests of the nation. "It must not be impeded by those who pervert honest criticism into falsification of fact." So those dissenters who criticize the policy of the government are now all of a sudden guilty of falsifying fact. That must not be allowed to happen. "It must not be impeded by self-styled experts, either in economics or military problems, who know neither true figures nor geography itself." So when somebody criticizes the government and has actual evidence that the government's policy is failing from either an economic or a logistical perspective, all of a sudden that person is discredited. He's just a self-styled expert who doesn't really know, even though he pretends to know. Of course, one of the great tasks of government during a war effort is to use propaganda to attempt to discredit the opposition by any means, including ad hominem attacks such as this one. "It must not be impeded by a few bogus patriots who use the sacred freedom of the press to echo the sentiments of the propagandists in Tokyo and Berlin." So, wait a minute. When somebody thinks he's genuinely patriotic, and he loves his country, and he wants his country to be kept out of war, and he wants the inhabitants of his country to be safe, he's all of a sudden a bogus patriot who is somehow mysteriously echoing the sentiments of propagandists in Tokyo and Berlin. "And above all, it shall not be imperiled by the handful of noisy traitors, betrayers of America, betrayers of Christianity itself, would-be dictators, who in their hearts and souls yielded to Hitlerism and would have this republic do otherwise." So, noisy traitors are people who oppose the government's war effort, who don't think that the war is being rightly conducted, or ought to be conducted at all, even though they may have the best motives in mind, and they may in fact believe that not having the war would be better in terms of everyone's interests. Those are traitors. That is how dissent is treated under a wartime government, be it American or otherwise. And if John McCain has his way and there are more wars, you can bet that dissenters will be treated in the same way. Franklin Roosevelt, during the war, exercised a virtual totalitarian control over the lives of civilians. He deported hundreds of thousands of innocent American citizens of Japanese descent into concentration camps. He censored the press. He imposed a 100% income tax on all incomes above $25,000. And, of course, he murdered hundreds of thousands, about 400,000 Americans, because he instituted a policy of conscription. So this is the kind of intellectual influence that McCain's ideas on foreign policy have. If you support this foreign policy out of principle, then you should also be able to say, out of principle, that you agree with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, and disagree with the American founders, and disagree with Andrew Jackson and Grover Cleveland and Ronald Reagan, because that is where the battle lines are drawn. You can either have peace, commerce, honest friendship with all nations, or you can have this kind of warmongering, sacrifice-mongering, perpetual devastation, advocated in favor of the strenuous life. I believe that the latter is completely unacceptable and will completely ruin our civilization and its future hopes for progress.